Welcome back. If you enjoyed that keynote with Lord Turner, I'm sure you're going to enjoy this session as well, which is a panel with some of the leading organisations in the UK and with lots of experts as well. So it's titled Energy Crisis. Does it risk derailing net zero or will it turbocharge it? Here to moderate the panel is Simon Retalak, Director of the Net Zero Intelligence Unit at the Carbon Trust. Simon, welcome. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Ralph, and a really warm welcome to our panel discussion on net zero and the energy crisis. My name's Simon Retalak. I am Director of the Carbon Trust's Net Zero Intelligence Unit, not, let me reassure you, a secret undercover operation, but a recently launched capability at the Carbon Trust dedicated to providing experience-led insights to accelerate global progress towards net zero. I'm delighted to be joined today by a first-class panel of leaders and experts on the transition to net zero, who I will introduce in a moment. But first, a quick word from me on the context for our panel today. First, net zero. On Tuesday this week, we got what sometimes seems like a weekly, if not daily, reminder from the scientific community that the imperative of reaching net zero isn't some optional political project, but one deeply rooted in the science. The update from Copernicus, the EU's climate monitoring service, confirmed what communities all over the world are experiencing firsthand, namely that the climate crisis is accelerating. The report catalogues a long list of extreme events and records that have been broken worldwide. To take just one example, Copernicus confirmed Europe experienced its warmest ever summer last year, with serious real-world consequences in terms of droughts, loss of food crops, and fires. Climate impacts like these remind us of the importance of the 1.5 degrees C objective enshrined in the Paris Climate Change Agreement, a goal we can only achieve if we cut global emissions in half by 2020 and reach net zero by 2050. And on that, the Copernicus report confirmed that we still have a long way to go. It found that global emissions continued to rise last year and have now reached their highest levels in the atmosphere for 2 million years. So while accelerating impacts is clearly driving up the urgency, there's also a growing sense that there needs to be a step change in our collective effort. In the midst of this challenge, of course, comes the post-pandemic surge in demand for energy and the war in Ukraine, delivering the greatest shock to fossil fuel prices in over 4 decades. Fossil fuel-based energy clearly lies at the heart of the climate challenge, with nearly 3/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions globally coming from energy use. So could the twin drivers of cost and energy security that have emerged from this energy crisis catalyze a turning point in our approach to energy, turbocharging action to get to net zero by boosting clean energy and energy efficiency? Or could it derail it by incentivizing a return to coal or more domestic extraction of oil and gas? That's the exam question we've set our panel today. And what a great group of people we have to answer that question for us. Let me introduce them. First, Nina Skorupska. Nina is Chief Executive of the Renewable Energy Association, the UK's largest renewables and clean technology trade association with over 750 members. She previously held several senior leadership roles within the RWE Group, including joining the board of the RWE's Dutch business, Essent, as Chief Technical Officer. And I hope you don't mind me saying, Nina, you are one of the heroes of the renewable movement, a veteran in the best sense of that word. We're delighted that you're with us. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're also joined by Vijay Chowam. Vijay is Head of Energy and Carbon for Virgin Media O2. In case any of you missed it, Virgin Media O2 was formed in June 2021 as a 50-50 joint venture between Liberty Global and Telefonica through the merger of their respective Virgin Media and O2 UK businesses. Vijay worked for O2 for 14 years and is responsible for leading and developing energy management across the VMO2 business, including environmental compliance, energy procurement, and carbon emissions reporting. Very warm welcome to you too, Vijay. Thanks for joining us. Thirdly, we're joined by Garrett Quinn. Garrett is Group Chief Sustainability Officer for Smurfit Kappa Group, Europe's leading corrugated packaging company and one of the leading paper-based packaging companies in the world. Garrett joined the group in 2000 and has occupied a number of roles, predominantly in operations, managing corrugated box plants in the UK and Ireland, and subsequently moving to Head of Investor Relations for 5 years. Warm welcome to you, Garrett. Thanks very much for being with us. And last but not least, a really warm welcome to Dominic Gogol. Dominic is Deputy Director for Policy at the We Mean Business Coalition, a global non-profit coalition working with the world's most influential businesses to take action on climate change. Dominic's responsible for the coalition's policy advocacy in the US, the UK, Europe, and South Africa to accelerate climate action in the face of the energy crisis. Dominic's been at We Mean Business for 3 years and was previously in the private sector, consulting on energy and water policy, and before that at WWF UK. Wonderful to have you with us. Thank you all indeed. Let's start with that opening question. Does the energy crisis risk derailing net zero, or will it turbocharge it? Nina, over to you. 4 minutes max, please, from each of you on this one.
Okay, well, it's either or. The energy crisis has certainly put energy front and center in nearly everybody's minds, whether you're a trade association leader like myself representing renewable energy and clean technology and going to the government and saying, I told you so, renewables and clean tech are now the most cheapest, through to people in their homes who are very concerned about their everyday bills. But we believe it is turbocharging matters, that there are a lot more interest in renewable energy and clean technology. And one of the jobs that we do as the REA is when we talk to our members across power, heat, transport and circular bioresources, we ask them those questions. How are we doing? And in fact, we ask them, particularly the international players, how does the UK compare with other leading European nations who are also facing that challenge of the energy crisis? And in our Energy Transition Readiness Index review, the feedback from the members was there is a lot more interest, a lot more inquiries, businesses are delivering, you know, the case making that wind and solar and all the other renewable energy technologies, whether at large scale or absolutely incorporated in the businesses' sites and in people's homes, there is a way forward, but there are challenges ahead. I think part of the demand increasing is seeing the fact that various components for the renewable energy technology are really going through the roof, and we've got challenges on skills. But we'll come back to that a little bit later, I think, because I know you've got some interesting questions for us further on in the panel session. But yes, it is turbocharging, but there are issues and problems and concerns.
Nina, thank you very much for that succinct answer. We will indeed hopefully return to some of those questions in the discussion later. Vijay, same question, please. Over to you. What's your view?
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, thank you, Carbon Trust, for the invitation also and for the chance to participate in this event. I think, in short, it depends on the sector and the type of business, and there's no clear-cut answer to this one. I do agree with Nina, though, and it's a yes. Energy costs, they are shining a light on energy consumption and raising awareness, and it's having an impact on carbon, a consequential impact on carbon in both absolute and relative terms. Some companies will be focusing on reducing their absolute consumption of energy. Some will be focusing on their relative efficiency improvements, and some will be both. And it won't always have an impact on carbon. You know, if a company is using renewable energy, for example, and they can cut their consumption by half, yes, it will reduce operating costs, but it won't reduce carbon. So we need to be mindful of that as well. On a positive, what it will do is introduce the concept of additionality. You know, every kilowatt hour of energy that we don't use, every kilowatt hour of renewable energy we don't use, is available in the market for somebody else to use, and that puts us in a better position when it comes to capacity in the UK. Less pressure on generators, and equally, it's cost effective. For us, it makes business cases more attractive. Currently, in the current climate of high energy prices, it's making paybacks quicker, and it's making longer term deals, renewable deals, more attractive, whether they be on-site renewable or off-site renewable generation, sort of PPA type deals. I think it could turbocharge net zero further if government and businesses decide to do more and go further, and this will ensure longer term security of renewable supplies and make sure that the capacity keeps up with the ever increasing demand. And as Nina mentioned, raising awareness. I mean, it's raised awareness, and people are now more conscious of the energy they consume. I mean, I think most people now know what a kilowatt hour of energy is and what it costs compared to maybe a year or two ago, but also where their energy comes from as well, which I think is positive.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Vijay, for that. Over to you, Garrett, now. Again, same question, please.
Thanks, Simon. So I would say, is the energy crisis derailing net zero? I think the answer for us would be a no. It is it turbocharging? I guess maybe I'll try and give some color on that. We have, in the last year, 18 months, we've continued to invest in the long term as a energy intensive industrial, making cardboard boxes for anybody who makes a product and ships it around, be it locally or internationally. In the latter half of 2022, we announced the largest decarbonisation project in our company's history in Colombia, which will reduce anywhere between 5 and 10% of our total company's footprint with that one project. We also, in September, successfully trialled hydrogen. We were the first paper mill in the world to successfully trial hydrogen in our paper mill in France. And what was nice about that project is it was a collaborative project across Siemens. The EU funded it in part. We had universities from across the UK, Germany, and Greece. We had other companies like Centrax also involved. So a really good collaborative project and a world first that allows us to look around and look past 2030 as to what might be available and how it would apply to our business and the investment requirements. And then equally, I think what's important for us, certainly, and hopefully for everyone else, is it's not just about targets and roadmaps, but it's also about delivery today and actually getting on with action today. And we've continued to have sequential emissions reduction year on year for the last number of years, and we would expect 2022 to be another one. So looking at kind of, there's, I guess, some real examples as to why I would say it's not derailing it. And if you look to why it's not derailing it, I think there's a number of reasons. And in Smurfit Kappa, we would have strong governance structures. So we would have senior management incentives are linked to the delivery of sustainability KPIs, of which the emissions reduction target of 55% by 2030 is one of them. And we have interim targets in between. Our cost of funding, so on the debt side of our business, is also linked to the delivery of sustainability KPIs, again, of which climate and emissions are one of them. And we also have a highly engaged board and a subcommittee of the board, which is a sustainability committee with experienced individuals with sustainability expertise. And I guess I would just use the phrase highly engaged. So you've got that, yes, it is still progressing, supported by strong governance. And then again, for us, I guess, is trying to tie it more and more to the business case. So we have I know it might sound cliched, but you want to do the right thing. And we do. And hopefully those who know the company will speak to that. But equally, you need to see, well, what is the business case? Am I going to attract better people? Am I going to retain the right people? Am I going to attract investors by being stronger in sustainability, attract customers? And I think that is something which we continue to develop, but very, very much front and center as opposed to being derailed.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for those insights, Garrett. Dominic, what's the view from We Mean Business on this one?
Yes, thanks for having me. So I'd split the question in two. I'd say so far, I think the UK has continued to deliver on net zero, so it hasn't derailed. So I would point to more policy leadership and financial support and political leadership, both in the US with the passage of the IRA and the Repower EU plan. But so far, the UK certainly has not derailed it. But I think next winter is actually where it's going to be more challenging, where we will have a stronger challenge across Europe to refill gas storage and gas reserves. So I do think that will need a particular focus. And I wanted to cover kind of 2 points in terms of a kind of a platform for why we should accelerate the transition to net zero instead of kind of slowing it down or giving into some concerns or some kind of calls to kind of slow it down. And that would be kind of why. What's the benefit, and not just in emissions terms, but what's the benefit for households, what's the benefit for the economy and for jobs. And the second is on kind of where UK business is in terms of backing net zero from across the campaigns and initiatives that We Mean Business run. So in terms of the socio-economic kind of the why, how it benefits UK PLC, we commissioned a piece of research last year that looked into just this question, which is what would be how would the UK economy, household energy expenditure and jobs look like in 2025, 2030 and 2035 on the way to net zero for 2050. So we'd have some real kind of rigor to the policy advocacy, which we do along with our 7 coalition partners and the thousands of businesses that we work with. And it's a very strong, compelling story in terms of the findings that we had from this modelling. On average, per capita, most individuals would benefit by £84 in 2025. If you look at the average 4-person household, that's already significant savings that people are going to be seeing. And these grow significantly to 2030 and to 2035. When if you look by 2035, the average household would be saving £1,388. And when we're, as the earlier panelists were talking about, the cost of living crisis is biting down, people's perceptions about their energy bills is that much higher. A saving like that, which can happen while also kind of reducing emissions, is a really powerful one. And the kind of the good story is likewise carried over in terms of economic growth, which is better than a business as usual scenario in all 3 of the years that we measured, and in jobs. Hundreds of thousands of jobs created in the clean economy versus a business as usual or high carbon scenario. So in terms of the benefits for kind of UK PLC, they're absolutely clear. Now, the second point I wanted to kind of talk through was in terms of where UK businesses are at, or at least in terms of the initiatives within the We Mean Business Coalition. So if you look at the Science Based Target Initiative, the kind of bedrock of corporate climate action globally now, that has over 4,000 committed companies as of late last year, which represents $38 trillion in the global economy. And the UK is the #1 geography within the Science Based Target committed companies, with 700 companies who have committed to the science-based targets. And the rate of companies committing to reduce their emissions in line with science has only grown over the last year. It has not faltered in the face of the energy crisis and high energy costs. And likewise, our other initiatives like RE100, which is about setting 100% of renewables targets, and EV100, which is about setting 100% electrification of a company's fleet. Both have seen huge increases over the last year. So in terms of from the kind of the 2 points I wanted to raise, the benefits are absolutely clear for why we need to be accelerating the clean energy transition to net zero in terms of helping hard-pressed households, generating jobs and growth, but also in terms of the bedrock of kind of UK corporate kind of action that is happening in this space, and policymakers should take confidence in setting policies which now will be needed over the next year to ensure that we really build on this to halve emissions this decade. But we can kind of talk through those specific policies a bit later in our discussion.
Dominic, thanks very much. We will indeed. And I agree absolutely, certainly about the need for those of us involved in this transition to spell out the benefits for consumers. Generally, across all 4 of your responses to the key question, very encouraging. And I think if we needed an evidence base that looked at this question globally, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, isn't a bad place to look. And of course, towards the end of last year, we saw a really key publication from the IEA on energy that had some pretty remarkable statistics on renewables. They are forecasting that renewables are set to become the largest source of global electricity generation by 2025, surpassing coal. And there is a strong sense that this is linked to the energy crisis, in as much as this predicted renewable capacity expansion is 30% higher than the IEA predicted last year, representing the largest ever upward revision of IEA's renewables forecast, apparently. Now, of course, it may not all be down to the energy crisis you mentioned. Key policy interventions in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, and of course, we've got the 5-year plan in China and Europe's own initiatives, but hugely encouraging. On the flip side, we have seen also apparently an increase in coal use by 1.2% last year, as some countries have chosen to put coal-fired power plants back online. But on the whole, the trend is clear and very much towards increased deployment of renewables and other clean energy, I should say. All sorts of things here to unpack, and we've had some questions in from attendees. Thanks very much for those, and just a few in the next half hour or so to go over with you, panel. Starting maybe with a look at some of the challenges to achieve net zero for your sectors. Obviously, cost is only one part of this, and the energy crisis has really highlighted that. But there are other challenges, maybe starting with the UK, Nina. I know that the UK government's made a commitment to decarbonise the UK's electricity system by 2035. They've indicated that they might be willing to relax restrictions on onshore wind. What are the big barriers to further accelerating deployment of renewables in the UK from your point of view, and to get to that decarbonisation target for 2035?
Well, just looking back for a short period of time, anybody who's lives in the UK and works in the UK will not be surprised that the frequent change of leadership of our government has kind of stalled the progress of various different legislation being laid in Parliament, the Energy Security Bill, and then all other not distracting but very important requirements to help deal with the energy crisis. So we're still at the moment working through a complexity around the electricity generator and levy, which ultimately is saying, anybody who's made some extraordinary profits over and above what you would be expecting to pay because of where power prices and gas prices soared to, we've got to work that out. So what that has done is, with all the burgeoning amounts of financial investment to come on in based on the historic net zero strategic plan, everything's just stopped, in terms of the mass investments. Where the government has given direct grants, then the barriers are not necessarily policy certainty, but more than about grid infrastructure, how to connect, planning applications, how the on-off view of how we should use our land in the UK. The scaremongering that all of a sudden the beautiful green fields of the UK were going to be covered by solar panels, which is absolutely bonkers around that kind of scaremongering. So there's some real fantastic, lovely lights of positiveness at this moment in time. But we've got to get to a position of normal review and making progress. We are now in 2023. The last thing which is of interest, which was a little bit of another shining light or golden thread, was that in the UK, they did ask Chris Skidmore, MP, to do a net zero review. And for once, it's not been a let's do a review and 3 years later we'll be with you and talking to it and carrying on debating it. It's actually going to get published on Monday. So hopefully the new prime ministers and the new ministers that are in play are not just going to say, thank you very much, Chris, let's put it in the back shelf, but actually we'll look at what that means for business, for really delivering economic value for the UK. Because even with all the hype and the excitement about renewable energy, let me just point out the metrics. 2020, at the end of 2021, and also indications for 2022, we're still only around about 40-oddish% renewable power. And remember that ambition is to be net zero on electricity and power by 2035. But then heat, we're not even in double digits yet on renewable heat. And the embarrassing situation on where we are on transport is really scary. That's less than 5%. Because we keep hearing about electric vehicles and the excitement around that and hydrogen. Just focus on what those numbers tell you. We've got a long way yet to go, and businesses are the solution. And we've got to get the markets, policy, regulation, all aligned in order to deliver this.
Nina, thanks. Obviously, really important points there, particularly on the need to focus on heat and transport, often overlooked in this question. It's not all about power, clearly, and a long way to go. Vijay, obviously, Virgin Media O2, very different sector, very dependent on action to decarbonise the grid to achieve your ambitions. And to remind attendees joining in, Virgin Media O2 is a commitment to reach net zero across its operations, products and supply chain by the end of 2040, I believe. Obviously 10 years before the sort of global target. From your perspective, what are the main challenges to reaching that goal that you've set yourself?
Thanks, Simon. So I think in terms of the three areas you mentioned before, investment, technology and policy, from an investment point of view, that's a biggie for us. We operate large, complex, fixed and mobile networks up and down the country, and that takes significant investment to upgrade. It's not an overnight thing. It costs a lot of money to do that. We are investing. When we do invest, we do see step changes in terms of energy efficiency, both in absolute and relative terms. And that's been driven by two things. We're not a manufacturing company. We don't make anything. We buy all of our network equipment in, and it has to come from somewhere. It has to be manufactured somewhere, and somebody has to go and buy it. So there's two parts to that. One is we're finding that our suppliers are doing more. So they're providing us with more and more energy efficient solutions, or solutions that have power saving features already built in, and they're able to articulate the carbon impact of that equipment. And the second, it's driving it from our side. So making sure that as a condition of doing business with us, suppliers have things like carbon efficiency roadmaps in place. They're tackling challenges around where the equipment is made, how it's made, and how much carbon is embedded within those products and services. Because once it's handed over to us, we then take the mantle of, well, how do we operate that equipment, making sure that it has to be cooled effectively, it has to be maintained effectively. And so they're the two parts associated with investment. When it comes to technology, for us, it's looking at those harder to reach emissions. We've talked about electricity a lot on the call so far, but what about those harder to reach emissions? Things like refrigerants, off-grid solutions where you can't just connect to your site. We have masts up and down the country. Some of those are nowhere near a grid connection. They have to be on top of a hill or in the middle of nowhere. How do we power those sites? How do we power them in a low carbon way? Okay, we use gas. And so all of those examples, there isn't an off-the-shelf solution as yet that completely decarbonizes those. There are solutions there that strip the carbon away. So we're moving away from high GWP refrigerants, for example, and we're moving away from refrigerants altogether in some cases, where we're introducing free cooling for some of our sites. But in terms of generator backup, gas consumption, it's not forgetting that the technology isn't quite there yet, and it needs more investment and more innovation to strip the carbon out from that technology. But again, linking it back to the supply chain as well, it's important that we know where that equipment's manufactured and how much carbon is embedded. Scope 3 is our biggest source of emissions, and so for us it's really, really important, and it's overwhelming. And for us, it's really important that we don't lose sight of that also. And then finally, policy. I think policies can and will continue to be influential to make sure that we end up in a low zero carbon future, especially with the points that have already been mentioned. Those harder to reach emissions, really important for us, I'm sure really important for everybody else, but equally setting ambitious targets accelerating renewable generation, as I think Nina's already mentioned, but also decarbonising transport, for example. And I wanted to touch on that point. It's one thing having the targets to decarbonise, but it's another thing having the underpinnings, the infrastructure, the investment that says, okay, when we're all driving around in EVs eventually, are we all going to be able to charge when we want to charge? Where are the pinch points? Will there be enough battery backup, for example? Is it dealt with locally? Is it dealt with by the grid? Who manages that? And all of that isn't an overnight answer. There are things that need investing now to build for those ambitious targets.
Thanks, Vijay, very much. Garrett, do some of those issues resonate with you? Obviously, Smurfit Kappa also has a net zero goal for 2050, manufacturer, different sector, but what's your take on the key challenges you face to get to that ambitious goal?
Well, I think some of it does resonate, and I guess maybe to go back to the positives of it not derailing, I think the global energy crisis, what we have found over the last 12 to 18 months, and probably counterintuitively, is that two challenges or barriers have been removed, and that they would be two key stakeholders for us as a business, which would be investors and customers. And so right at a time when you think that in the case of COVID, that there might be concerns as to the focus on sustainability and climate related activities, investors really got involved and enhanced their due diligence. So it wasn't just you're rated by company A, I'm happy with that. There was much more due diligence being carried out and greater interest, which has been sustained into 2022. So that is, I'd say, a barrier or a challenge that's been removed. Like, why would you do it? And I think customers as well in 2022 have really engaged at a much greater degree and at a much more senior level on the need to deliver. So I think they're both real positives that I would say previously if we did this panel 2 years ago, you might have had some signs from the investors, less so I'd say from the customer. So then when you look at what are the challenges that remain and the main challenges that remain for us, I would say on scope 1 and 2, it's that availability for that high energy that we need to produce paper, which similar to Vijay is gas, predominantly gas. So we need to look at how do we get green sources of energy, low carbon technology. We operate, in over 30 plus countries. So you could kind of get your head around how Europe and UK within the continent of Europe can deliver on what is needed. But we also operate in over 10 countries in Latin America. So how do we make sure that the development of infrastructure in those countries is fit for purpose and green? And a lot of those countries have very strong coal backgrounds. So how do you green the grid in these geographies when they have that inherent natural resource? So I think some challenges there on the geopolitical front. And then I think the other part, which again, as a business, and especially as a public business, you need to balance, and I know this may not be the most popular thing to say, is you have to get the balance right between delivering financial returns and delivering on your sustainability commitments. And for us, so far, we've been able to do both. And that is most definitely our intention to continue to do both. And I guess therein lies the challenge for corporates, is how do you continue to get that balance right between delivering financial returns and delivering on your sustainability commitments. So for scope 1 and 2, I would say they're probably the key challenges. On scope 3, outside of data collection in the first instance, because we could spend a couple of hours on scope 3, or more than a couple of hours, probably a couple of weeks. I would say in terms of how do we decarbonize our scope 3, I think when we look at zero carbon transport solutions, there's nothing clear. So when we look at the various, partnering with the right people, working with them, motivating them, prioritizing people who are SBTi aligned, we can see how we can partner with the right people on scope 3. But when you look at transport, that's the one that really doesn't seem to have a medium to long-term solution that I think we can buy into just yet. We trialed electric trucks, not ready yet. We look at moving away from road transport where it's available, so using lower carbon solutions like rail. Probably expect biofuels to be the solution in the medium term, and hydrogen possibly in the longer term. But again, not clear in our mind. Investment required, which again would echo something of some of what's already been said. You've got a lot of existing assets, so how that's handled. But I think even the tech itself is not clear for us in terms of how do you electrify or through other zero carbon solutions for transport.
Gareth, thanks very much. Dominic, a lot of challenges raised there. Obviously, I know as part of your work, you look at what sort of policy levers need to be pulled to accelerate the pace of change. What do you think the most important policy interventions are that you prioritise to address some of those challenges and get to net zero?
Yes, absolutely. I'd say, if, as I mentioned earlier, now we need to be looking forward towards next winter and beyond, where it's a different set of challenges that we'll have. And I'll focus in terms of the policy measures, which I think need real focus is on the demand side, because I imagine Nina will probably have better ideas than I do on the supply side. So in terms of demand, the UK government launched its consumer engagement campaign in November, which is way too late to actually have cut through and really work with the public about understanding the dynamics of your bill, how to reduce it, the steps that you can take. If you look at comparable to Germany, they launched it in July with a massive national campaign with celebrities, and it has had cut through. And they also have overarching targets to have reduced gas demand nationally of, I think it's 10 or 15%, which the UK doesn't have anything comparable to that. So I think it's demand is where we have most agency over reducing it through consumers and what businesses use. And we haven't, I don't think, prioritized it enough in the UK. So if you want to look at other measures, which Whitehall should be focusing on at the near term, it's household energy efficiency retrofit programs. What measures can be done now, what can be done in the medium term, and how to finance it. Likewise, what can be done with the public and commercial building sector in terms of retrofit. Then if you look at the easier solution amongst all of those is lowering thermostats. You could have public awareness campaigns of lowering the average thermostat. And the IEA has looked at both of those examples and seen very clear benefits of actual reduced gas demand per year for doing it. And it helps hard-pressed consumers. This ultimately reduces their bills, and it reduces their bills not through a public intervention or subsidizing the bills. It reduces it through them actually burning less carbon in the end. And EV charging infrastructure is certainly something that needs to be prioritized. It's very encouraging, the EV and hybrid purchasing numbers that were in the end of 2022. But now we need to make sure we have the charging infrastructure in place to really allow the full electrification of transport this decade, because if it's missed and public confidence is broken by it, we might not have enough time to kind of recouple that again. So it's something that the UK government should really be focusing on to getting right. And I won't repeat the benefits of why we should be focusing on these policy solutions again, but it's really, if we want to be helping the most hard-pressed households, we want to be generating growth, which is, of course, one of the top government priorities, accelerating the clean energy transition through these measures, and there are many others, which I'm sure my colleagues on the panel can outline, is in our national interest to do.
Thanks very much, Dominic. Nina, on the supply side, as Dominic was saying, what would you prioritise? What do you want to see, for example, from the UK government when it comes to onshore wind and planning? And also, lots of people interested in this question of decoupling the cost of electricity from the cost of fossil fuels and gas in particular right now. What's your view on how to do that with policy in mind?
Well, before we started talking about the energy security bill, the government did launch, and people may have heard the phrase REMA, the Review of the Electricity Market Arrangements, earlier in 2022, which then got pushed to one side as we looked at the very specific cost of living crisis and the energy bill element of it. So this also then started to happen and go in parallel and in track, and then some things pushed to one side. And the very important energy security bill, which includes the creation of a future system operator who will then work and look at how our power system is going to work, the way that we will incentivize people to locate renewables and businesses at the appropriate parts of the country, all happening, all needs to come about. So we need this bill and then those activities to be accelerated. The last time I was involved, because I'm 61 now, in a national energy market review was back in 2001, 2002, when NETA was introduced. That took 5 years, and then when we introduced the ERM aspects to even get renewables going, that still took 4 years. So how long is REMA going to take to get this through and to get everybody aligned? So we create the markets that reward people for doing the right things and give those signals. That's what investors internationally and in the country all need to work together. The grid infrastructure, what we need to connect the offshore wind, which is one of the big successes of the UK, to everything that's happening onshore, as you say, onshore wind. What's the rule around planning and way leaves and securing that? I think we're getting better and overcoming NIMBYism, not in my backyard, but let's really get an intelligent approach of communities and local authorities all benefiting from choosing to put in the right choices for a low carbon generation solution. Excitingly, we've seen, the different regions of industrial hubs and starting to bring together and collaborate sectors that are going to be finding very difficult to decarbonize, such as steel manufacture, concrete, and other heavy energy industries. So we've got to take the hype out of hydrogen and really make sure that we're delivering low carbon, net zero hydrogen in all of those solutions and connecting all of those dots. And that's what the government needs to do, is enable those frameworks to happen. I could go on. This is my day job, ladies and gentlemen. So if you want to talk on more, but my priorities are getting that legislation through, getting the grid infrastructure and the market mechanisms enabling, so that businesses are helped to make the right choices. Technology is not an issue anymore. We can deliver, it's low cost. It's more about that framework and that enabling aspect that really has to be brought to bear. Oh, and then zero carbon homes. Let me just throw that one in for a last one. That should have been done back in 2015, 16, by the way. But yeah, the government back then suddenly kicked that into the long grass, and here we are still struggling.
Nina, thank you. I wish we did have more time because it's fascinating, and I'm sure other panel members would want to come in on this, but we've got 6 minutes left. And I've promised that we'll get to another important area before we wrap up, which is for those companies that may be listening that are sort of starting on this journey, it can seem quite intimidating. Obviously, there are still a lot of barriers out there and challenges to get to net zero. A lot of policy solutions still need to be developed to address some of those. Government needs to act. But there's also a lot that companies can do right now. And Garrett, and then Vijay, maybe it'd be great to get a quick sense from you. What are the sort of key steps your companies have taken to get to net zero that you're proud of, that you think could be worth sharing with attendees? And then all of you, I think, to wrap up with a piece of advice for anyone listening in. If you're starting on this journey, where would you start to get to net zero? But let's start maybe with Garrett and tell us a little bit about what you think has been a key step for you and your company on this journey.
Sure. Thanks, Simon. I would say, well, there's going to be legal reasons why you need to do this. But if you go back to the voluntary aspect, it's report on what you're doing. Don't be scared of doing that. I think the TCFD gives you a good framework to at least start thinking about how you should be structuring yourself around this. I think you need to, in time, and again, not wanting to scare people, is assure what you're doing. So make sure that someone's actually checking what you say you're doing to make sure that you are doing it. And then critically, as I said earlier in the call, actually doing something. So are you acting? Are you delivering rather than a fancy roadmap or some distant targets? In terms of what we're doing, we're trialing new tech. So for a company that has grown to being a FTSE 50 company through delivering good, solid financial returns, we tend to not want to invest in things unless you can guarantee a return. And so what I'm proud to say, and back to your question, Simon, is that as a company, I think we're maturing there. We're trialing tech that we don't know if it will succeed. We don't know, even if it does succeed, will the infrastructure to supply it, like green hydrogen, be widely available in the geographies where we operate. But the good news is we're thinking about it in 2022, 2023, when commercially probably won't be available until the 2030s. So that to me is something I'm proud of, that we are trialing a new tech in a controlled manner. And then the last part I would say is collaboration, which I'd say has moved on in leaps and bounds in recent years. We're not trying to do it yourself, actually working up and down your value chain across the industry to try and develop new technologies. And I think that is something which we feel has definitely gone to a much better place.
Fascinating. Gareth, thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us. Vijay, what's your perspective? Similar sort of set of questions, really.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. So I think the starting point, having complete and accurate data, it has to be data driven. Knowing your numbers, setting clear targets and underpinning them with the right level of resource and investment. I think aligning to SBTi, it's been mentioned a few times on the call already. Having science-based targets is a good step. We at Virgin Media O2, we've used the Carbon Trust route to net zero standard to make sure that we're putting the right building blocks in place to support our own internal SBTi aligned targets. Putting good governance in place, visibility and accountability, and actually doing the doing, as Gareth has said. But just focusing on the visibility, it's making sure that the right level of collaboration is there. Make sure that the finance community is on board, and make sure that you have a seat at the table, whatever table that may be, where the decisions are made. That's paramount. Whether it be an investment forum or internal investment committees, bang the door down and get a seat at that table. In terms of advice, there isn't one piece of advice. I think to reflect on the points that have already been made by all the panelists today, to collaborate. I think be bold, don't be intimidated, and if you haven't already, start now. But if you have already started the journey, then challenge why you can't go further and faster.
Vijay, brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Dominic, very few seconds left, but brief take from you, advice for organizations starting on this journey. What would you say?
Building on both Gareth and Vijay said, it's setting a science-based target, hugely important to align your organization. But realistically now we're in the action phase about the how are you going to do it? How are you going to measure it? What are the near-term targets you need to put in place? And I point you to a resource which we create, the Climate Transition Action Plans, which is how companies can grapple with this, how they can disclose their emissions, and crucially publish it. Publicizing this generates momentum to how we are doing it, how we are going to kind of change the economy, how we're going to engage our consumers in the future economy. So I think I point towards that in addition to what the others said, which I think they said very well. So back to you.
Thanks, Dominic, very much indeed. And Nina, last word to you. What would your advice be to organizations setting off on this journey?
I would say I love many of the words that my colleagues have just shared with you: brave, bold, measure, data, science-based. But more importantly now, there are technology solutions. It's great to hear of pilots and demonstrations are happening. We now need to scale up and roll out and deliver, so act. Collaboration is the key, and there are so many fantastic UK-based organizations as well as our international colleagues who have that knowledge. It's just about putting your hand up and saying, come on, we're interested in learning more. How can we actually do it now? In a way, I think we have to do this despite where our government is. So it's a value-based proposition to grow the economy and your businesses.
Nina, thank you very, very much indeed for that. What wonderful advice, words of wisdom from all four of you there, for everyone listening in. A huge thanks from all of us at the Carbon Trust to you for for joining. Nina, thank you. Vijay, Garrett, Dominic, you've been fantastic panelists. I really appreciated the discussion, some fantastic insights. And I will just take away 2 key things there at the end to anyone listening. What great advice. Be bold and collaborate. I think those are good places to start at least. But for now, from me, that's it. Thank you very much.